My son was strangled on the playground, and the school turned a blind eye until I fought back. I remember exactly when it began. It was late September, just a few weeks into my son Max's kindergarten, when I first heard him timidly confess in the backseat of our car that there was a classmate picking on it. I'd asked him, out of sheer habit, "How was school today?" expecting the usual chatter about what shapes they drew or which books the teacher read aloud. Instead, I got this tiny, trembling voice whispering that a boy named Steve had been pushing him on the playground and calling him names. My heart sank the moment I heard it. There's this primal instinct in a parent that flares up when you realize someone might be harming your child, especially at an age as tender as 6. But I tried to stay calm for Max, to guide him the best way I could. I told him that if Steve ever bothered him, he should say, loud enough for the teacher to hear, "Leave me alone," and if it continued, to walk away, and if it still continued, to tell the nearest adult right away. I thought that was good advice. I didn't want Max to be too frightened to stand up for himself, but I also didn't want him to get in trouble for fighting back physically. His teacher had mentioned wanting to raise them with empathy and respect, and that was exactly how my husband and I were trying to raise Max. On top of that, I reached out to Max's teacher on the phone. He seemed genuinely concerned, or so I thought at the time, and he told me he would keep an eye on things. I figured, in the best of worlds, that would be all that was needed. Teachers are trained, schools have policies, and bullies usually back down when they see consistent adult intervention. I told myself that it wouldn't be an overnight fix, but that an attentive teacher was a major step toward resolution. But hope can be fragile. A few days later, Max told me how he and Steve had been sent to the bathroom together, unsupervised. I remember Max's cheeks getting all pink as he described Steve shoving him into one of the stalls and growling, "Get in there!" It was so specific, so detailed, and Max looked so genuinely upset that my first reaction was shock, followed by a slow burn of anger. Why on earth were they sent to the bathroom alone if the teacher already knew there was a problem? That night, my mind reeled with worry. I pictured that cramped bathroom, the harsh fluorescent lights, the echoes of footfalls on the tile. I thought about Max, a sweet, kind-hearted boy who'd never even been spanked at home, suddenly feeling powerless and cornered by another kid. He was 6, and in that moment, trapped in a stall, I could only imagine how big and terrifying the world must have felt. It tore at my heart. I called the school again, determined to have a face-to-face meeting. This time, I wanted both the teacher and the principal present, and I wanted to figure out a consistent plan that they would hold themselves accountable to. It took some back and forth, but I finally got a meeting. Sitting in that little conference room, I felt a swirl of anxiety. It smelled faintly of dry erase markers and cleaning supplies, and the fluorescent lights made everything look overly bright, almost sterile. The teacher reassured me that separating Max and Steve during activities would be a priority, that they'd change the seating chart, make sure to escort them at different times if they needed to leave the classroom, and keep an extra eye on them during recess. The principal, a man who seemed professional enough on the surface, cautioned that we can't guarantee it won't ever happen again. I remembered trying to keep my voice calm, reminding them that yes, I understood perfection was impossible, but all I wanted was for them to take these issues seriously, to acknowledge that the responsibility of protecting my child was, in many ways, in their hands for a good chunk of the day. They kept insisting that they'd work together on it. And honestly, back then, that was enough for me. This was my first real brush with the complexities of school bullying as a parent, and I felt it wise to proceed gently, to remain open to communication. I didn't want to start a war with the administration. I just wanted my child to be safe. So I left that meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. For a while, it seemed to calm down. Max stopped reporting any mean behavior from Steve. I naively allowed myself to believe that the school's new procedures, keeping them at a distance, rearranging seats, had nipped this problem in the bud. I began to feel my shoulders relax whenever I asked Max about his day, and he would say, "Good," with genuine brightness. No mention of teasing, shoving, or name-calling. It was a relief I clung to, especially as the days grew cooler and the routine of school started settling in. Then came the phone call that turned my cautious optimism into dread. I was at home, folding laundry, when my cell phone buzzed in the living room. It was the principal telling me that Max had been punched in the stomach during recess. I almost dropped the phone. While I'd known Steve's aggression could be physical, the idea of him directly hitting Max, that direct blow to his stomach, felt like a new level of violence, and I reeled with anger and panic. The principal apologized, assured me that appropriate disciplinary action would be taken, and said he was sorry that Max had been hurt. I didn't even hesitate. I told him I was on my way to pick Max up. My priority was to get his story while it was fresh. The principal then asked me something that rankled. "Are you sure Max didn't do anything to provoke Steve? Sometimes kids will say something insulting." That question, in that moment, carried a certain blame-shifting tone that made me feel livid. My blood was roaring in my ears. How many times had I told the school that Max's track record had always been squeaky clean? He was gentle, He'd been in daycare and preschool programs before without any complaints whatsoever. Teachers had always spoken highly of him, describing him as polite, playful, and empathetic. The principal then offered a justification. Apparently, Max had called Steve fat, and that had supposedly prompted Steve to defend himself. I remember going utterly silent on the other end of the phone for a good few seconds, my mind whirling. I thought, well, if Max actually did call Steve fat, then yes, that's unacceptable. But at the same time, words, especially from a 6-year-old, do not justify a punch to the stomach. And I was stunned that the principal seemed to have latched onto that detail as a reason for the violence. I told him calmly that I understood name-calling is not okay, and my husband and I would have a talk with Max about respectful language. But I insisted that being physically assaulted over a word was worlds apart from being insulted, and the focus should not be on blaming the victim. The principal quickly changed his tack, reassuring me that Max wouldn't be disciplined for the incident. He promised to speak with Steve's family, but there was no specific follow-up or clarity on the actual consequences for Steve. Days turned into weeks. The teacher implemented some anti-bullying strategies in the classroom. I recall Max coming home with little worksheets about empathy and kindness, and the teacher awarding kindness stars to students who helped their classmates or said encouraging things. For a time, I was hopeful again. I heard nothing more about Steve, no new tales of pushing or insults. Maybe, I thought, that meeting and their new measures had truly made a difference. But then came the day that turned everything upside down. It was a mild, sunny afternoon in late autumn. Not quite winter, but crisp enough that Max wore a little jacket to school. I was at work when the call came around 3 p.m. I recognized the teacher's number on my phone. The moment I answered and heard her nervous voice, my stomach dropped. Something had happened again. I picked Max up as soon as I could. The teacher hadn't witnessed the incident herself, but said there had been a dispute with Steve on the playground. She apologized for not having more information. As soon as we got in the car, I gently prodded Max to tell me what happened. He began by describing how he and 2 friends, one named Zane, were playing some kind of restaurant game in one of those little enclosed spaces under a playground slide. Max is an imaginative kid. He loves make-believe games, and the teacher had told me before how he'd use the window under the slide like a drive-through window. Then, as Max described it, Steve showed up and started sticking his hands in Max's face, probably to irritate him. Max was polite at first, telling Steve to stop, but Steve kept doing it. My son recalled saying, "Stop, or I'm going to tell the teacher." At that, Steve threw Max to the ground. I felt my blood run cold as Max recounted the moment he landed on his back in the playground gravel. And then worse, Steve allegedly demanded that Zane beat him up, as if orchestrating violence. Zane refused, which, thank goodness, showed that not all children are susceptible to that kind of intimidation. But what Steve did next was beyond anything I'd imagined. He climbed on top of Max and began strangling him, hands around my child's little neck. Max's voice trembled as he told me how he felt pressure on his throat, how he tried to wiggle free but couldn't, how he felt his eyes widen in panic. He recalled how he tried to shout for Steve to stop, but his voice was cut off by the constriction of Steve's hands. In desperation, Max apologized to Steve. Apologized for something he didn't even do, just to make him stop. And that was when Steve finally let go, after hearing the words, "I'm sorry," from my terrified child. By this point in the story, my own throat was tight. I could feel tears pricking my eyes. Max was 6. The idea of him being pinned down, strangled, forced to say, "I'm sorry," just so he could breathe, was horrifying. I was livid, grief-stricken, and guilt-ridden all at once, wishing I had taken him out of that class long ago, wishing I had done more to protect him. But that wasn't even the end. After Max and Zane scrambled away to tell the teacher, Steve still wasn't removed from the situation. In fact, Max claimed Steve was swinging his jacket around after that and ended up hitting Max with it. Whether it was on purpose or not was unclear, but it showed there was zero separation between bully and victim. The teacher didn't see the main attack, so no one intervened in real time. The shock I felt turned into something more potent than anger. It was maternal fury. I felt as if I had done everything the right way. I had called the teacher, emailed, visited in person, had multiple conversations about prevention, rearrangements, supervision. Yet here we were, my son describing a situation that sounded almost cinematic in its cruelty. A child strangling another child under a playground slide. I decided that enough was enough. I called the school that same day and demanded to speak to the principal immediately. The receptionist told me he wasn't on campus. He was off at some training or another. I insisted on a phone conference, even though I doubted how much we could accomplish if he wasn't even physically there to investigate the matter. I went through the story in detail, my husband by my side, listening to me relay the horrifying sequence of events. My husband, who generally tries to stay calm, asked the principal point-blank if he was aware that a child in his school had just strangled another child. The principal's reaction stunned us. He became defensive, almost dismissive, saying something like, I wasn't there. I know nothing. What do you expect me to do about it at this moment? The call ended with me telling him that I refused to let Max return to school until we had a proper face-to-face meeting to address what had happened and to make sure my child was safe. I reiterated that I wasn't looking to get Max moved to another class. That felt like punishing him for being the victim, but that I wanted the incident formally documented with a signed incident report. I also wanted to view any camera footage that might exist. I'd had enough of them failing to believe or act on my son's words. And if the school refused to comply, I was prepared to escalate. The principal seemed exasperated and basically said, "Fine," in the sort of tone that suggests a significant eye roll on his end. He said something vague about needing time to gather information, but I was clear that I wanted answers within 2 days. I ended that call feeling shaky and exhausted, yet oddly determined. I felt that I was finally following that primal parental instinct: protect your child at all costs. And I wasn't going to back down or be placated by empty apologies this time. That night, I tossed and turned. The memory of Max describing those hands around his neck was etched behind my eyelids. The guilt nagged at me. Maybe I should have pulled him out of the class months ago, or insisted on a stricter supervision plan, or even notified the authorities earlier. But I'd tried to follow the official processes. I'd tried to believe the school staff. I'd tried, over and over, to approach the situation calmly, yet we ended up here. The next morning, I submitted a formal bullying report to the school district superintendent. I spent the day on edge, waiting to hear back from anyone with a shred of authority who might validate my concerns. My phone was quiet. A friend of mine, who's also a parent, told me I should consider filing a police report if the school refused to take documented action or review the footage. Another friend sent me articles about new Texas laws on bullying, telling me about her own experiences with school negligence. All of it just confirmed that I wasn't overreacting. Strangling another child is extreme, no matter how young they are. And if the child who did it isn't taught or disciplined appropriate, who's to say it won't happen again? Finally, we got our meeting. When Max and I arrived, I could see the principal waiting in the office. This time, I wasn't alone. I brought along my husband. The atmosphere in that office was tense. Staff were darting glances in our direction, as if they knew something big was happening. We were ushered into the principal's office, which was decorated with motivational posters and a row of children's books about respect and friendship on a shelf. Usually, those posters make me smile, but that day, they felt hollow and ironic. The principal asked Max to recount the incident. Sitting there in his little chair, Max looked so small, but I was proud of how he answered. He calmly explained the entire story, just as he had told me. Steve putting his hands in Max's face, Max telling him to stop, Steve tackling, demanding that Zane join in, strangling, and finally letting go when Max apologized. The principal listened, nodded, and asked gentle follow-up questions. "Can you remember exactly how he put his hands on you? And did you see the nurse after you told your teacher?" Max answered every question earnestly. He even put one hand around his own throat to demonstrate the position of Steve's grip. Then the principal turned to me, looking far more subdued than he had on the phone. He immediately apologized for how the conversation had gone the other day, saying that he too had children and was a father, and that his dismissiveness wasn't typical of him. He apologized for how he'd sounded defensive and essentially incompetent on the phone. He said something like, "I hope I can regain your trust," and I appreciated that he led with an apology. It wasn't enough to erase the damage, but it was more than I'd gotten from him before. He then explained something that made me both angry and oddly relieved. He told me that this was the first time he, personally, had heard the full story of what happened. He said that in a situation involving physical violence, especially something as serious as strangulation, there's a protocol that should have been immediately followed. The child should have been sent to the nurse, a report filed, and the principal notified right away to conduct an investigation. None of that had happened. The staff, he said, had failed us by not following those procedures. As a result, he was in the dark until I called. Hearing him admit that gave me mixed feelings. On one hand, I was glad he was owning up to it, but on the other, I was outraged that the teacher or playground monitors hadn't escalated this when it happened. He also confirmed that the other two boys' accounts aligned perfectly with Max's, and that he had already reviewed the footage from the playground. While there wasn't a crystal-clear angle of Steve's hands on Max's neck, there was enough of a commotion to see that Max was thrown down, that something happened beneath the slide, and that the boys immediately rushed to the teacher afterwards. He said he couldn't let me have a copy of the footage, due to privacy laws concerning minors, but he offered to let me record it with my phone once he blurred the faces of any other children besides Max. I appreciated that gesture. It was a sign of transparency. Then he told me he'd taken disciplinary action with Steve. He couldn't tell me exactly what it was, citing confidentiality, but he hinted that Steve's family was really upset with his decisions. But he said firmly that he wasn't going to budge, that I stand by what I decided, and I'm going to protect my students as if they're my own. I felt relief flood through me. Finally, a serious stance on the matter, not just a half-hearted scolding or an insinuation that Max might have instigated. The principal then said something that resonated with me. That kind of behavior is learned, and I've notified the appropriate authorities to investigate. It's what many people in my circle had been saying, that a 6-year-old who strangled a classmate likely has witnessed or experienced violence somewhere else. This was not normal impulsive child behavior. It doesn't excuse it, but it does mean he needs more intervention than just a superficial, "Don't do that" speech. He ended by promising me that Max and Steve would have no further interactions for the rest of the year, that he would ensure they didn't end up in the same classroom the following, and that Max was safe. He even asked if he could drop by Max's class each day to check in on him personally and ask how things were going, as an extra measure of reassurance. He wanted to demonstrate that the school was serious about protecting him. After all the stress and sleepless nights, I was surprised to find myself nodding and saying, "Yes, let's see how it goes." When we left, my husband was quieter than usual. I think he was still processing the principal's sudden shift in attitude. I was too. It was such a stark contrast from the cold, defensive man I'd spoken to on the phone. On the car ride home, I decided to ask Max how he felt about going back to school, now that the principal had promised to keep him safe. I watched him in the rearview mirror, his small face reflecting on the question. Then, so simply, he smiled and said, "Happy." The release of tension I felt in that moment was immediate, like a huge weight dropping from my shoulders. If Max was willing to trust in the school again, then I wanted to give the school a chance to prove its sincerity. That weekend, I hovered over Max more than usual, silently looking for any signs of trauma. Was he sleeping well? Was he flinching if we so much as raised our voices? Did he feel comfortable playing pretend or going out in the yard to run around and be a kid? Thankfully, he seemed okay, resilient, the way children often are. He had a few nightmares, or at least restless nights, but he was overall so excited about the idea that someone important at school was now on his side. In a child's eyes, the principal is almost like a king overseeing the castle. The fact that the king was going to check on him daily made him feel special, valued, and protected. I caught myself marveling at his ability to bounce back. If I'd been strangled by a classmate at 6, would I have wanted to go back to school at all? I was proud of his strength, but I also recognized that he probably didn't grasp the full gravity of what could have happened under that slide. He knew it was dangerous and scary, but life-threatening? That's a big concept for a kindergartner. I still had lingering questions. What if the protocols failed again? What if there was some new oversight and Steve managed to corner Max somewhere else? Was the teacher disciplined for not reporting it properly? Would the aides on the playground receive more training? The principal couldn't go into details, but I guessed from the tension in his voice that there would be changes among staff. I decided I'd temporarily assume the role of helicopter, checking in daily, requesting updates, ensuring that words were turning into actions. By Monday morning, I accompanied Max to school with a mixture of hope and apprehension coiled in my stomach. The principal was waiting right by the entrance, greeting students. I walked Max up to him, and the principal gave my son a friendly pat on the shoulder, telling him, "We're going to have a great day, buddy." Then, with a slight respectful nod to me, he mouthed a quiet, "I got this," and I gave him a nod in return. I'm not the type to trust blindly, but something about his demeanor, the apologetic sincerity we'd seen, convinced me that perhaps he truly did regret having let us down. I went home, still anxious, still half expecting a phone call about some new incident. But the hours passed, and eventually 3 p.m. rolled around without any message or call. I picked Max up, and when he hopped into the car, I greeted him with, "How was your day?" He grinned widely. "It was awesome," he told me. He said the principal dropped in during story time and whispered to him, "Doing okay?" Max whispered back, "Yes," and they both nodded at each other like conspirators. The days that followed were a series of cautious steps. I made sure to speak with his teacher face to face, to confirm that she was aware of the seriousness of what had happened, and that she was committed to ensuring Max was never unsupervised near Steve again. She looked a bit haunted, as though she knew she had dropped the ball. She apologized profusely for not acting immediately, telling me she genuinely hadn't understood how severe the situation was until Max's friend Zane's parents also raised alarms. She explained that the playground aides were supposed to be rotating around the equipment, but she realized that if there's a blind spot, children can do just about anything, and that's a failure in supervision. I appreciated her honesty. She seemed shaken up by the gravity of the situation, maybe even worried about her job. I wanted to be compassionate, acknowledging that teachers have so many students to watch, so many responsibilities, but strangling is serious. I told her I hoped we could all work together, teacher, principal, parents, to ensure nothing like this happened again. Meanwhile, I kept checking in with Max about how he felt each day. Did he see Steve? Did anything happen? Max shrugged it off, saying, "No, we don't even see each other." Or, "I see him in the hallway, but a teacher's always there." It seemed that the staff really had rearranged the schedule and the routines to keep these two kids separate. After a week, I allowed myself to breathe a bit more easily. After 2 weeks, it felt like maybe we'd turned a corner. In a final meeting with the principal, he gave me a sort of recap. He said that Steve was now required to see the school counselor regularly, that his parents were aware of the seriousness, and that the principal had taken measures that he believed were going to make a difference. He didn't go into detail, confidentiality laws, again, but I got the sense that child services might be in the loop if there was any suspicion of abuse or exposure to violence at home. I felt a flicker of empathy for Steve as well. The idea that a 6-year-old could orchestrate a strangling was deeply disturbing, and it made me wonder what environment he was exposed to. I hoped he would get the help and guidance he needed. The principal promised that if I ever had further concerns, I could go directly to him. He expressed gratitude that I hadn't escalated this into a lawsuit or a full-on district scandal, and I told him quite frankly, I would have if I thought it was the only way to protect my child. I said it calmly, but I wanted him to understand how close he'd come to a PR nightmare for the district and how it wasn't about being vindictive. It was about making sure no one else's kid ends up strangled on the playground. Through it all, I found a new layer of respect for the everyday battles parents have to fight when it comes to bullying. It's not always as simple as telling your child to stand up for yourself or ignore the bully. Sometimes the bully is relentless. Sometimes the school staff is inattentive or dismissive or overwhelmed. Sometimes children under 5 feet tall can enact shocking aggression that belongs in an adult crime drama, not a kindergarten playground. And parents are left trying to balance advocating fiercely for their child while also not alienating an entire school system that has the power to make or break a child's educational experience. In the end, though, I felt that the resolution was, if not perfect, at least satisfactory. The principal recognized the school's failure. He took steps to protect Max, and Steve was receiving consequences that seemed more fitting than a mere slap on the wrist, hopefully with some counseling or interventions that might help him manage his aggression. I was relieved I didn't have to leave the school entirely or transfer Max halfway through the year. I've continued to remain vigilant, and I suspect I always will. Anytime Max mentions a minor conflict at school, I'm right there, gently questioning, was Steve involved? Or how did the teachers handle it? But I realize Max is still just a kid. He's more concerned with whether he gets to be line leader or who he sits next to. My big fear that he'd be scarred or terrified to go back to school never materialized in the way I worried. Children can be remarkably resilient, especially with the right support. A few days after Max returned to school, he brought home a drawing he'd made in art class. It showed 3 stick figures, him, Zane, and what looked like me. Hard to tell with the crayon scribbles, but it had a ponytail, so I assumed it was me. The figures were all smiling. He told me it was us being happy because the mean stuff stopped. I nearly teared up. It's a small thing, but seeing that on paper was like a sign that he was healing, that in his mind we'd turned a page. Now, looking back on this series of events, I feel a complicated mix of relief, caution, and resolve. If someone asks me, was that meeting with the principal sufficient? I'd say yes. Sufficient in the sense that it acknowledged the gravity of what happened, resulted in a clear plan to keep my child safe, involved actual disciplinary measures for the aggressor, and included protocols that should have been standard all along. It didn't undo the trauma of that day beneath the slide, but it helped ensure that Max wouldn't have to live in fear every time he stepped onto the playground. And for me, personally, it was an awakening. I realized that as parents, we sometimes have to push harder than we think is polite or comfortable. We have to demand accountability, especially in situations where our kids' well-being is at stake. We can't assume that our children's schools, no matter how good their reputation, will automatically see and address every serious problem. That doesn't mean we demonize the school system or the teachers, but it does mean we remain actively involved, raising concerns when necessary, and persisting until we see real solutions. I'm still going to keep my ear to the ground, so to speak. I'll continue to ask Max about his day, about who he played with, about whether he feels safe. I'll stay on good terms with the principal and teacher, but I won't let complacency set in. Max might grow older, new bullies might arise, and I'll be ready. Because once you see how easily children can slip through the cracks, even at age 6, you realize vigilance is essential. Thankfully, for now, life has returned to a normal rhythm. Max is excited to go to school, to learn his letters and numbers, to make friends. He loves recess again, unafraid to run around with the other kids. The new seating charts and supervision strategies seem to be working, and every so often the principal does indeed drop by Max's classroom, giving him a thumbs up or a friendly wave, and I can see the pride it gives Max to know the man in charge has his back. A few months down the line, I hope that this will be a memory that fades in importance to Max, just something that happened when he was little. And for Steve, I hope he gets the intervention he needs, because every bully is still a child, and that child deserves help in unlearning the harm he's been taught or exposed to. It doesn't excuse him, but it helps to remember there might be a reason for his violence beyond just He's a bad kid. Maybe the principal's involvement will be a stepping stone for him too. For now, though, the chapter closes on a far more hopeful note than where it started. If you were to ask me if I made the right decision by standing my ground, I'd say absolutely. Did the principal truly learn a lesson about how to handle these situations? Only time will tell. But at least he recognized, out loud, that the school had failed Max. And that's more honesty than I expected. I'll take that, along with the renewed sense of safety and security that Max has, as a sign that this story reached the best ending it could, under the circumstances. I'll keep an eye on my sweet boy, but for now, he's happy to be back in class, surrounded by friends who want to play restaurant in the playground's little underslide windows, and not a bully in sight. And as a mother, hearing that excited, happy, when I ask him about school is all I could have hoped for. Sometimes that's the most powerful kind of victory we can celebrate.